Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we sit down with Katie Bauer, who's a data science manager at Twitter. I think the 280 character limit has trained Katie to speak with a high density of wisdom and wit. She's one of my favorite follows on the Bird site and has a very practical, original view of the data ecosystem and data management. This is an episode geared towards practitioners and especially data people managers. We talk about the value of data, building data teams, and of course, data tools.
I'm so glad that there were two of us on this episode because I don't think that I could have kept up with Katie on my own. There was just like so much interesting stuff that came out of her mouth every time she started talking. And even I kind of sprung maybe like a surprise question on her towards the end of the episode. And I thought it was like...
And she nailed it.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite parts of the conversation.
Yeah, no, Katie's special. I was glad that we got her on the show. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Katie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I've been a fan of the newsletter and the podcast for a long time, so this is going to be fun.
That's very kind of you. Your academic background is in linguistics, which if you asked a 10 years ago version of me, I would have made fun of you as a nerd and I wouldn't have understood why anybody was interested in that topic. But today version of me is like incredibly fascinated by the way language shapes reality, or at least human reality. It is not that common for a 20-year-old in undergrad to be fascinated by this topic, though. What got you there? How did you end up majoring in this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It was also amazing preparation for being a data scientist because no one knows what linguists do either. But growing up, I was always really interested in languages. So in school, I would just try to take languages if I could. I'd try to read about them in my spare time. And when I was thinking about going to college, I was thinking I might major in French because that was the language that I knew the best at that time.
Did you grow up in a bilingual household? Where did this interest come from?
It was just a way of learning about the world. I actually grew up in a small suburban town outside of Akron, Ohio. So maybe it kind of felt like a way to access the broader world. But at any rate, I was going on college tours and learning about what majoring in French would actually entail, and it was a lot of literature. And I love literature, I love reading, but I was really interested in grammar. Finally, someone said to me, maybe you should talk about linguistics or think about linguistics. And I was like, what is that? And started reading about it and learning about it, and it sounded like exactly what I wanted to do. So I ended up studying that.
I can only imagine. I studied finance, which is like the most practical of all imaginable things in college. And so I think that our brain states at that part of life were very different. The interesting thing...
We still ended up in data, though. We both ended up in data. So
that's exactly where I wanted to go with you. You got this degree, and then I think not so long afterwards, you found yourself in not just like a data adjacent role, but like in an actual full-time data role. How did that transition happen?
The funny thing about it is I had learned to program a little bit in the course of being a linguistics major. Like I dipped my toes in R for quantitative sociolinguistics, which is a social science for people who don't know. And I also done a little coursework in NLP. So I was like, I don't really want to do more academia right now. I'm going to move out to the Bay Area and try to work in tech. And in a strange twist of fate, I ended up getting hired by a natural language search startup as a linguist to annotate data sets and help with their ML algorithms. So I worked on query parsing a little bit and just a lot of general purpose analyst work because it was a very small company where we all kind of had to do everything.
That's not in most people's hiring plans. Data hire number 4, the linguist.
Yeah.
Did you know in undergrad that this was like a thing, natural language processing? Was it a hot field at the time?
No, not really. I really thought I was going to be doing something that was more related to the social science aspect of linguistics, or maybe kind of the formal elements of it. It's an interesting field because there's like humanities stuff in it. There's formal logic. It's very mathy in some parts. And then there's where it intersects with computer science. And that was just a course that I took, and I was like, this is really cool. I want to learn more about this, and intentionally studied it more. I don't think Word to Vec had happened yet when I graduated. So
yeah, that was
a lot of what I learned was not relevant.
Or something like that.
Yeah, or I think it might have been 2013. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But at any rate, a lot of the stuff I learned was a lot more traditional, like logic and AI type of stuff, where it's more like induction and rules based types of things. There were some statistical things. Like I remember having a project where I wrote a machine translator that was like they just had two corpora, which was the transcriptions of the Canadian Parliament. One was in French, one was in English. And just by pure statistical correlation, you could build a machine learning, or rather a machine translator to do that translation, which was really interesting because at least if you study linguistics, depending on where you study it, because there's different philosophies as well, people don't think of it as like being a very statistical thing, at least how it works in the human brain. But word2vec is a really good example of that because it's really just about co-occurrences and making sure things appear in similar contexts. So,
was your linguistics focus unusually mathy and statistical, or is this a good sampling of like a random person who has a linguistics background?
I don't know if I have like a good sense of the distribution for what people choose to focus on. It's probably different now, honestly, at this point.
Yeah.
But at least compared to some other people, it was probably a bit more mathy and statistical. But it really, really varies.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot today already. Okay, fast forward a little bit.
Yeah.
Found yourself working at kind of the apex of all kind of technology and society, which is to say that you were doing content moderation in the late 2010s.
Indeed,
You cannot imagine a hotter topic in this particular era. There's a lot to say about that, but before saying anything like more tactical, I'm just curious for your level of kind of hopefulness of this kind of grand project. You know, we have these massive social platforms. They contain multitudes, like, and that's kind of by design. Do we have any hope of constructing systems that are able to make judgments about the boundaries of speech on these platforms?
Heavy-hitting question there.
Yeah, right? just dive in wherever you want to take it.
Yeah. The context, since Tristan didn't say it explicitly, I worked at Reddit in the late 2010s, and something that I think about Reddit works very well and maybe is like a good model for how this kind of thing should work going forward is that it is very human-based. One of the main reasons that it works as well as it does is because of an army of volunteer moderators who just care so much about the subjects and are deeply knowledgeable about the subjects and the contexts for their particular communities that they
complain
run.
Vociferously the minute that they don't feel like they're being respected by the anyway.
Yeah, I mean, like, deservedly so. They're doing a lot of stuff that makes the site work. And like, even though there are automated forms of content moderation or flagging things, so much of it is done in partnership with the users of the platform. And that is something that I think is maybe a good model going forward, is because it's very within context and very, the people who are potentially being subject to the moderation are involved, and like their perspective and opinion is better represented, I think, than a lot of other solutions to it. Like, I don't think we'll ever have a fully automated thing. It just doesn't make sense to me, especially given how quickly cultures change and how quickly language changes. It's just so hard to do that at scale.
And how quickly the concerns to watch out for in the social context that all of these systems operate in change.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
It's interesting that product design and community design are so interrelated. And I think that we have a lot of language and tools to talk about product design. But I had anticipated that I was asking you a data question, but in fact, your answer was a community answer. And
yeah,
I think that we are actually pretty bad at knowing how to be intentional about the ways that we steward our communities. I know that from a first person perspective, we have a reasonably successful data community that we steward, but it doesn't feel like we know what we are doing. Let me just put it that way. It feels like we have some good intentions and we try to move one step in the right direction all the time. But I don't know, at Reddit, where there's such clear understandings of like, how do we get our community to productively engage in the ways that we want?
Not at all. I mean, that was like one of the interesting things in data, actually. I mean, like, I will also say, and I want to call this out explicitly, the community team there was phenomenal. The person who ran the team at the time, Evan Hamilton, if you're interested in subjects of community, he's really kind of a great person to read and just a really good thinker about the space. The community team did a lot there to make the site function and help us figure out what we needed to do. But from a data perspective, it was also really interesting to think about the problem of why do communities grow and why don't they?
Yeah, I think that's really super fascinating. I think in a lot of the ways you approach problems, Katie, is you're just like a very practical thinker and not overly principled. I was prepping for this podcast and I read your thread of threads, and just if you haven't seen Katie's Twitter yet, it is just so rich of nuggets of knowledge. But there was one thing in there that stood out to me that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper with you on the show, which is you talk about what the primary role of being a data analyst is, or what data teams do. And I would describe it as they are a necessary but not sufficient requirement for companies being successful. And that the primary role of a data team is accountability, which I don't often hear that being described as the main goal of a data team. I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you think data teams are necessary, why it's important for companies to invest in them, and if they are actually a requirement of being a successful business.
That is a topic near and dear to my heart. And I'll also say, I don't think it's only accountability. I think data teams have a unique role in that they are solving problems with data. And if you have the right kind of data at your company, you can use that to solve many different types of problems. Accountability is often the most pressing one. And it intersects with a lot of different things. Some of it is just understanding what's happening, which is where you probably should start if you're running a data team or building a data team, because it's very hard to hold yourself accountable if you can't just objectively state or describe what is happening or what has happened in your organization. So that's always kind of first order concern, is just what is going on. For that, starting concrete and really just basic things you always need to know is always the right way to start. There's a lot of discourse on Twitter and Substack and in the community general about dashboards and how people don't like them. But I'm personally a bit of a dashboard appreciator because they're just such a useful tool of actually making information widely available and concrete to people.
What is the argument against dashboards?
I think people do not think of them as a tool or as something that is going to continue to exist for a long time. A lot of times people will create it and they just want to be done. They don't necessarily think of it as a thing that they would go back to or be involved with. They just kind of want to create it and leave it. And if other people go and look at it all the time, great. They're creating them kind of to get people off their backs a lot of times. And they're not necessarily viewing them as a resource for themselves. Something I like to do is just look at dashboards I've created regularly, because it allows you to kind of see the business changing. Or if you're not explicitly at a business, maybe you're at a nonprofit, your organization changes. It's just a regular place you can go to and watch trends and hopefully proactively catch a surprise, a metric spikes in some unanticipated way. You'll know about that sooner rather than later if you're engaged with the dashboard regularly. Another thing people don't like about them is they fall out of date, but that's not the fault of the dashboard. That's the fault of the maintainer for not thinking about the jobs to be done of the dashboard itself. If the organization doesn't need a certain thing anymore and you're the person responsible for the dashboard, maybe you should update it or deprecate it. They don't have to exist for forever. You should just treat them as a product in and of itself.
There's been conversation recently about, what the heck does data product mean? And my spicy question for you is a data product really just a dashboard that has been well designed? I feel like so many dashboards are poorly designed, and we have really not, it's just not something that we train people on how to do well, that many of us have actually never had the opportunity to consume information visually in a way that was highly designed and effective. And so we had to say oh, dashboards, they're terrible. Those are data products. They're excellent.
Yeah, dashboards are the most obvious one. I wouldn't say they're the only one. I hear data sets and tables counted as data products a lot too. I would also argue there's probably formats that you can deliver this information in that are maybe not dashboards. I don't know, Slack bots are an interesting data product in a way. I've had people on my team write alerting Slack bots where if some job fails, the Slack bot lets them know. And a job failure it's maybe a metadata product. I don't know. But maybe when people are talking about data products, they're thinking more about the delivery mechanism. And the attention to that is maybe where people should be focusing more. Because I guess if you're thinking about delivery mechanisms as well, you could even say the slide deck is a data product. It's not an interactive one. It's not a live one. But it is a like purpose-built communication tool for the insights that you get out of data.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not that dashboards are bad. It's that we don't have good like habits and rituals around them, because it's like, how do you interact with the dashboard, or how do you make it useful for you or your organization, is where it can have dramatically different effects. Like if someone just creates the dashboard but doesn't take the time to revisit it or like figure out what's going on with the business, then it's lost all value. And so the delivery mechanism that you're describing around Slack or presentations, it's really about creating that interactivity or the different habits on how do you actually engage with the data. You speak a little bit about insights and why they're like overrated, and that a lot of times like data teams are wrongly focused on creating insights for the business, but that's actually not the role of a data team. Why are insights actually the wrong goal for data teams?
I mean, there's probably all sorts of like catchphrases you could coin around this. Like, it's not about insights, it's about knowledge. But this is part of why I say data teams should be solving problems with data. And sometimes the problem is that you need an insight. But like insight is just such a vague word. Like I know what people mean by it, but there's so much wiggle room in it. It really should be focused on around what people will do or actions they will take. And like people will give the word insight the modifier of actionable insights. But like something like growth accounting, for example, like it's a common framework people use to understand the growth of a business. That's the type of thing that is really useful for data teams to organize around, because action is baked in. If you've got like your DAU number, and then you've got like a sense of like, okay, well, like, new users are up, but we've had so much churn, like you know what to do about that right away. And like fundamentally, that might be an insight of like, our insight is that churn is down this month, but it is tied to a recommendation. And focusing really on like what people are going to do with the information you give them, or how you expect them to act, or what they're even capable of doing in some cases. That's the step that's missing, I think, a lot when people talk about insights being the goal of a data team. It just makes you sound like you're doing science fair projects if all you're doing is coming up with insights.
How do you know a problem's worth solving? So I think like that's a really hard problem with like how you work with your business stakeholders. There's always more insights, to use the word you hate, that can be had with data. But like there's this like so many options of where you can spend your time. Is it more push, more pull? When do you know like this is worth an effort of a data team getting involved?
That's a good question. I don't think there should be a blanket recommendation here. I mean, this is like the statistician. It depends. But like, I really think you should be conditioning it based on what stage your team is in, what kind of relationship you have with that stakeholder, what state your business is in. When you have a new product or a new area that you're working in, probably it's going to be a lot more pull. You just don't know necessarily what is necessary yet. So it's really hard to be proactive. You're still learning about the space. And in order to do that, you have to listen to what the business is telling you, or maybe what your direct stakeholder is telling you, and try to react to that. Probably a bit more than most people think they need to, because you're trying to learn and build a relationship with those people so that later you can anticipate their needs. The pull model there is also something that helps you to learn the space that you're working in. Maybe you have done data work in a similar domain previously, so you'll have a good sense of like the metrics and the rhythms of that type of business. But many cases you won't, because people like to do new things all the time. And it's important to take direction when you first start working in something, just to get a sense of what's important. And as you learn the space better, as you learn your stakeholder better, eventually you should start pushing more, and being more proactive and anticipating what they need. And I do think that stakeholders want this. There's a bit of a narrative of like, oh, they just always give us tickets, or like, oh, they give us this vague thing that we can't possibly do. Or just not being a service team, for example. Like that's kind of a meme, is that no one wants to be a service team. But you have to play a role in that yourself. Like you have to actually want to not be a service team. And you do that by trying to actually focus on driving impact. For many data teams, that is focusing on analysis on things that would be actionable, or giving them data or models or experiments, like whatever your particular deliverable is. like making sure that you are producing things that tell them what to do next and help them contextualize the things they're seeing and learn about the choices that they're making. That's how you get proactive, is that you make it possible for them to know what to do.
The data analyst, data professional often sits in between the technical part of the business and the customer part of the business. And you're talking about delivering actionable insights. And well, maybe I made that phrase up, but like things that drive action.
We can use the word insights. It's fun.
The thing that sometimes I have experienced in more junior data professionals, and completely reasonably so, is that actually in order to know what is actionable and what is not actionable, you have to know a tremendous amount about what it is like to do the work of the people on whose behalf you are working. It was one of my superpowers as a data professional is that I spent 7 years in marketing, and I could tell you everything about what was actionable and not inside of marketing data. And actually, now that it has now been like 6 years since I've been a full-time marketing professional, recently Apple made these changes to how cookies were handled, and it's like this whole thing, and I just never stayed up to date with that. And I'm very confident that my knowledge of web analytics, which dates prior to those changes, is not as relevant anymore. So it's this hard base of knowledge to build up and to stay current on. How do you like build this base of knowledge when somebody's job is actually to do something else?
Yeah.
Magic bullet time. Is there a secret
I have
answer?
a 5-step program. No, I don't. There's kind of like two things that maybe you're getting at. One is like, how do you learn a domain that you're working in? And another one is, how do we train junior people to do this job well?
Yeah.
I guess like maybe how to learn the domain. I have some general purpose recommendations that are maybe quicker to talk through. One of them is working really closely with your stakeholder and having a relationship of humility. And like the team that I manage right now, for example, it is very heavy on infrastructure and like very detailed like things about data centers and the machines inside them that I don't know anything about. So an approach that I take there, right, like at least I didn't know anything about them until recently. But my approach that I've taken there is that I've tried to be very humble about like, I don't know about this. I need your help with some interpretation. Like I can do description, I can tell you what happened, but I need your help to understand what's happening. So at least for a little bit, I'm going to be reliant on you for that. And that goes a long way because there's not a expectation mismatch of you're going to give them some really amazing recommendation that they don't already know about. Because probably you're going to tell them something like this happened and they're going to be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. In addition to that, there's also just a lot of like reading the documentation, attending team meetings, like making sure you're immersed in the activities of that team and their strategy and their goals, so that you have context for what's happening, as well as just trying to learn about it. Hopefully on the time of your company, doing some reading about it, or finding blog posts or finding informed people in the industry who maybe work for a non-competitor company that you can talk to and chat with and get some insights on how they've approached the problem before. I don't know that there's like a good single, one simple trick for learning domains, but it's just kind of an ongoing process that you need to rely on other people for and be clear about like what kind of value you can provide as a data professional, while you're still learning the domain. But you still need to learn the domain, at some point. The other thing that you were getting at, was managing junior people and how do we help them grow and learn their careers. And I think what you were getting at is like, there's a lot of just learning to do data work when you first start doing a job. That then when you add in learning the domain, it's just so much to ask of one person. And I think this is part of, like, I don't know, at least for me, like I've done a ton of hiring in the past year. And one thing that I felt very acutely is that it's hard to find people who are really experienced in this field, much less people who have deep experience in this field in a particular domain. And as time has gone on, my thought has been, for those of us who manage junior people or people who are just getting started, we really need to dedicate time to giving them clear objectives and tasks. If you have more senior people on your team, like a really great way to think about helping the junior people learn the work is delegate more procedural tasks to those junior people because it's well described, it's well understood, and they have someone to ask about it. And then the senior person gets to not do some really procedural kind of ho-hum thing that they maybe are tired of doing. Like it's kind of a win-win situation. If you don't have those senior people and you're the manager of that team, you need to be that senior person. And you need to commit your time to making sure people understand, like, this is the way that you should do this analysis. Don't assume they know, because they probably don't. Or maybe they think they do, but you just need to like solidify it in their brain of like, yes, you did this thing and that was the right choice then. The training aspect of data work is something that I think is still very unsolved, partly because we don't always know. But it is something that we really should commit to for those of us who are experienced, because it will make all of our jobs better later down the road and make the field feel like a fun and enjoyable place to work as well. And fulfilling, hopefully, financially gainful, all the positive adjectives.
I think one of the like interesting things that you touched on is just like reframing on how you can be helpful and having a bent towards action. You know, one of the worst things someone can do when they join a startup is point out all the things that are wrong or like messed up within the startup. Like startups are chaotic and like that's just going to be a reality. So instead of helping people observe problems, instead ask the question like, why was this not prioritized? Assuming that like people don't have their heads in the sand, instead of just like jumping in with like a consultative, like this is what needs to happen, really understand what are the blockers from making that idyllic end state of reality actually possible. And like knowing what's difficult in businesses is, I think, a really hard thing to understand from an outsider. So just like coming with that curiosity and a bent towards action makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's also like having some empathy for the people you work with. Like their choices were probably rational. Like sometimes people do like a weird chaotic thing that you'll never understand why, but almost never is that actually the case in a company. Like maybe they made a choice about what they were going to do based on constrained resources or constrained knowledge. Like figuring out what's missing and how you can help is such a constructive way to think about it. Like you're not there to stop bad things from happening. You're there to enable good things to happen.
Yeah, I think 100% of relationships can be solved if you just assume the other person is rational and like put yourself in their shoes. I wanted to talk a little bit more about like team building because you've had a lot of experience with that. There are different types of data teams. There are like platform teams that actually help with analysis, work really closely with business stakeholders. How do you set up these two different types of teams? What's a good way to get started as your data organization grows?
The best thing is probably to figure out which of those types of teams you're building. I say that because there's so much emphasis on things like self-serve analytics that people don't necessarily realize you might need a specific type of person who can do that. And I've certainly made this mistake before where I've hired analysts knowing that they're going to have to write ETL. And they don't realize that they're going to have to write ETL and just realizing like, oh man, we actually need to do a ton of training here for them to be able to do this job. And that can be very frustrating for those people to come into that situation thinking they were going to come and do a bunch of fun analysis. And they probably will still do fun analysis, but they might need to get through some other stuff first. So the first thing is just figure out like, what does your organization actually need? In some cases, you'll have very savvy partners who maybe can do some basic analysis on their own. And at some point, they may need help scaling. But if you've kind of got like that first level of defense of they know how to fend for themselves on basic questions, you should think about what do they need in addition to just having information available to them. And that's probably a harder situation, actually, like building an analytics first team, because it's so open-ended. Like it's an insights team. It's fluffy. It's kind of abstract what you're going to do. So really clarifying in that case, like what are the research questions? Like what type of information are we going to be finding and making available, and how are we going to do it? And when can you expect us to give it to you? That's really important for building that kind of team. If you are going to build a team like that, and the reason I'm emphasizing the analytics team or the insights team over the platform team is that's more of the type of manager that I am. But depending on what your potential scope is in an organization, figure out who your key customers are. Because another really huge and frequent trap that I think a lot of data teams fall into is everyone is excited to have data and everyone loves data. So they just pile on the analytics team. And there are ways of trying to serve everyone, but you probably shouldn't. One of my colleagues has a saying, data scientists are not pizza. You cannot split them up. And it's good advice. Like, people need to have a meaningful understanding of the context they're working in. So if they're switching between domains a lot, they're probably not going to be able to provide very useful analysis or information to their stakeholders. So they need to be able to focus on something long term, and you cannot support your entire organization very easily if you don't have a person to pair with every potential stakeholder. So being careful about what you commit to supporting is another really important part of starting to build a team like that.
So it sounds like for the insights or people that are doing more research, you would advocate for them being embedded into their teams, or centralized teams work. Does that work okay as well for like a more of an analyst role?
I would caution against a centralized team just because I think being close to decision makers and being close to your customers is an important part of working with them. It's not necessarily that they're embedded, like embedded versus centralized is the metaphor, but I think it's more being clear with analysts about what goal they're trying to solve or what goal they're trying to work to and who they share goals with, which functionally is embedding. But like maybe they don't literally sit with them. Maybe they work with more than one stakeholder who have similar scopes. What you're really trying to do is align their incentives with the people that they work with. And that is one of the best ways to make sure that they are actually focused on driving impact.
I think a lot has been written, in at least for software engineering teams, like how to better structure your both. They have the very similar paradigms where you have platform teams that do like shared internal resources or services that help enable product teams build the actual like customer facing products. And there's a lot of literature written about what are the right ratios, or like when does the EM to individual contributor ratio start failing? Do you need senior developers versus junior developers on your team? And when does that magic ratio start to really work for organizations? There's no like perfect answer because every company is unique, but I'm curious if you've found anything from your experience, like how big should data teams be? Should there be a big diversity on years of experience on the team so that you can have more mentorship and you can create more guidance for newer folks on teams? What have been some patterns that you've seen work well?
On team size, anecdotally, I find that, it depends on the scope of the particular manager in question as well. But I have found that 4 to 6 is more of a sweet spot for at least data science teams that are focused on analysis. And like, this is something that like I've talked to a bunch of people about this, and that's the number they've given me. And like, I've managed like 9 people directly and found it very difficult previously, because it's just the detailed knowledge that you need to be able to give meaningful feedback to people you manage. It's hard to do that when your scope gets really broad. I think that's one of the reasons why embedding is also popular, is that it reduces complexity for the people who manage the analysts or scientists or whatever title you happen to be using. But the junior senior question, I think if you have control over it, which you might not always, because headcount is really just an abstraction for budget. And if you don't have budget to hire a very senior person, sometimes you can't. But if it's a new domain where no one's worked before, you should probably try to hire a senior person first, because of kind of what we talked about earlier, where a junior person who's just learning how to do data work, having that person go sit in a domain with no other data people to help them, that's probably not going to be a very good situation for them. And like, if you are the manager of that junior person who doesn't have anyone else in their domain, it's your job to be their senior person, as I said earlier. But in terms of like cross-domain collaboration, that's another big problem that happens with these embedded style teams. And I don't know that I have a good general purpose solution to it beyond just making sure that people know that they have partners. Like, it's almost like you have like, this person's a major in marketing and this person is a major in growth. And the growth person's minor is marketing and the marketing person's minor is growth. And those two people can provide feedback on each other's work, hopefully share context with each other that helps them do it better. And this, if you start having a bunch of sub data teams in your organization, it's very helpful to organize them in this way, where their scopes are generally aligned and related. So maybe you do have like a GTM data team in your company, and within that, there is like a sales data team and a marketing data team and a growth data team, or like growth product, I guess is what I mean there. Trying to make sure that scopes are aligned up and down management chains, and also with stakeholder groups, is just a really good way to make sure that relevant context is shared and that people are able to get support and feedback from people who know enough about their work for it to actually be informative and constructive.
One of the things I'm really enjoying about this conversation is that it's getting into, and I don't think that we've been specifically asking you about this, but the conversation has gone there anyway. It's gotten into like management techniques. So a lot of times I think that data people, as very structured thinkers, tend to reduce the management of data teams down to this kind of like operational problem, like lines and boxes. Like, well, how should we design the lines and boxes and how many of them should there be and this kind of stuff. And you've at multiple different points in this conversation shared what seems to be like your mental model for actually what the job of a data science or data analytics manager is. I'm just curious, for yourself, what do you think is your superpower as a manager?
That's a good question. I think what I am trying to do is I am building a team. That's my deliverable, is the team that can do the work that needs to happen. And if there's a superpower, like this maybe feels like a cop-out, but I feel like my superpower is my ability to think at that level of abstraction about it, and like try to have my own mental model of like what are the inputs and outputs. Sometimes it's about like making sure that people's careers are supported so that they have like the mentors that they need or they have the support or direction that they need. Sometimes it's about tooling. Sometimes it's about having a clear roadmap or clear objectives. There are lots of different ways that you can make sure everyone is moving in the right direction. And being able to pick apart that problem is just something that I find really interesting and fun to think about. And that's also why I tweet about it so much.
This thread seems a lot like the maker schedule, manager schedule, like the recognition in software engineering that there are these two different tracks. And I don't know how long ago you'd have to go to find this, but certainly 10 years ago, if you looked in software engineering, it was generally people that had great technical skill sets that then got promoted into people management roles and then often thought of their own superpowers as their technical leadership. And we've, as an industry, figured out that that's actually not a good model. But you're firmly positioning yourself as like, I am a manager of data teams, and the skill sets that I personally develop myself along are more related to management. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like I'm still a competent analyst and a competent scientist, but I don't write a lot of code these days. I review it sometimes, but I just don't have the time, and I probably shouldn't be in the critical path of anything that needs to get done in a timely fashion, because I just have a lot of overhead that I have to think about.
So I want to hit one last topic. We talked about the need for data teams, or what are their values, how to structure them, some management style. And the last one I want to talk about is tools. And there's a lot of Twitter discussion about why tools is talked way too much, and the conversation around data is often too overly indexed on what tools people are using. And you had this like very interesting rebuttal where it's like, well, actually tools in the work that you do or the craft of data are so intertwined these days that there's a reason why we talk about tools. Tell us a little bit more about why you think the conversation around tools is really just another conversation about the craft or the data work itself.
So I work with an infrastructure organization, and it means I end up thinking about how infrastructure gets created a lot. Something that was once described to me is infrastructure is process that everyone agrees on. And that,
Gosh, that's such a good quote.
I guess I made it up. I don't know. No one said that directly.
This is all of Katie's Twitter, just like good snippets of wisdom.
But like for a lot of data work, we haven't like agreed on how we do things. And over time, as we start to recognize common workflows or very standard types of analysis or processes that we do, eventually it's like, yeah, like we know what we're doing here. There's not any deviation. Let's just make a tool so no one has to make a choice about this. And you can move through it and go to whatever other thing you find more meaningful. Like that's one reason why I think the tooling discussion is really just about work, because tools are process that got hardened into infrastructure. Another aspect of it is that it really reflects that the complexity of problems that data teams are solving is getting bigger because it requires us to collaborate now. A lot of like Excel is a great tool. Like, don't get me wrong. I like Excel a lot. Like I'm a dashboard appreciator. I'm an Excel appreciator, but it's really hard to directly collaborate with someone in Excel. If you've ever received a random Excel workbook from someone and you have to like go through all of the different cells and figure out what's happening and how all the tabs are related, like that's just a nightmare. And the push to be more like engineers is really just helping us get to more collaborative working styles because engineers are very collaborative. And like there's so much that is like baked into tooling that makes it so you don't have to understand detailed information about, like, I guess like a really good example of what I'm about to start describing is like continuous integration, for example, in a large code base. There are so many different other things happening in the code base that you probably don't have direct knowledge of. And having integration tests allows you to test before you push code into production, whether you're going to break something you don't know about. We don't necessarily have that with data yet, but we're starting to get there. Like, we're starting to have tools that require us to, or that reduce the requirement for us to know about every detail of something. And like, well, I'm fundamentally a practitioner. The tooling conversations are interesting to me because it's us all agreeing on something.
Yeah, I think it's totally the shift into like, how do you move fast, collaborate, and don't break things? And like, you can't do that without tooling. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. We're going to wrap up. This is a question we ask all of our guests, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
I hope it will not be a strategic advantage to have data or have data people at your company. I hope it'll be as boring as saying we have computers, or like as weird, maybe. Like, no one would say like we have computers at our business. So like, I want it to be a place where having a data team is just assumed.
Proficient in Word.
Yeah.
You no longer need that on your resume.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to say that you can type.
I love that answer. It kind of says like, I want this thing to melt away into the background. Like, it just becomes a part of life. But you said something in there. You said like, everyone has a data team. You didn't say everyone uses data. You said everyone has a data team. Do you think that in this 10-year version of the future, is an explicit data function inside of organizations necessarily a part of that? Or does part of melting away involve like it becomes a part of everyone's job and everybody can do this for themselves?
I could see that being one version of it. I guess I think of it as being similar to, say, building a website or something. A lot of companies will just use some sort of out of the box, or they'll pay someone or some service to host a website for them. But there are a lot of other companies that need to customize them or have some kind of functionality or some additional value add for their website. Like, I think there's probably always going to be something like that. The thing about data work is that it is so specific to contexts. And I don't know that we can have a perfectly abstracted version of data work that works for every company. So probably companies will always have data teams, or hopefully they will, in my beautiful utopian vision. The form they take will probably be really different, but I think they'll always have someone who's responsible for figuring out how things are actually working.
I love that analogy so much. There's the Squarespace and Wix end of the market, which is the $10 million GMV e-commerce company. And then there's the much more sophisticated and complex organization that needs their own web engineering team. Katie, thank you so much for being on. Where can folks find you?
Best place is my Twitter account. I might be Mary. I tweet frequently there, and you can go see the thread of threads that Julia mentioned.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.